Hey, I'm Steve Lamb. We're here again at Politicon with Progressives for Urban Politics. And, I'm sorry, Center for Progressive Urban Politics. It's been a long day.
It's a long day, exactly.
Yeah. And a guy just came by our booth named Ed Brotherton, and Ed's got some very, very interesting things to say about what is money. And so we just talked to a guy about a bank, and now we're going to talk to a guy about money. So, Ed, what's your viewpoint on what lawful money of the United States is?
Well, you simply go back to the Constitution itself, and there is a term used in the document twice, and it's the dollar.
Okay.
And as anyone who understands the rules of constitutional interpretation, words that are used in the document must retain the same meaning today as they had when it was adopted.
You mean it's not flexible?
It's not flexible unless
It's
you
not a
want
living document?
It's not a living document unless you want to go through a constitutional amendment.
Okay.
Under Article 5. Then it's perfectly fine to be able to change the Constitution.
So no one's ever changed any of the stuff that relates to this thing called the dollar?
Not in a legal sense. Not in a constitutional sense.
Right, okay.
Which is there's a fascinating history there. But first you have to identify what the dollar is. If you go, you learn that by going back to 1707 with Queen Anne's proclamation.
Okay.
She basically announced a proclamation that made the Spanish mill dollar the unit of account, the money of account, and that was what the colonies were using in order to conduct trade. It was a very popular currency at the time, and it was essentially a Spanish mill dollar. And then when the Constitution was ratified, they essentially adopted that as the money that we were using in the country.
So what did they define then as the dollar?
In 1707, under the Queen Anne's proclamation, I can't remember the exact number, but it was around 420 some grains of fine silver.
Okay.
But from 1707 to 1787, they knew that there was some wear and tear on the coins.
Okay.
So what happened was they created when the Constitution was adopted, Congress has the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof and fix the standards of weights and measure.
Okay.
Which is very important because the dollar is the monetary unit by which we are to regulate the value of all other coins at the time.
Okay.
So they ended up creating, in order to determine what the standard was based on the wear that they assumed was going on, they created a committee and they pulled a bunch of these coins out of circulation, and they started to do a metallurgical analysis on them, figured out what the actual content was, and the average came out to be 371 1/4 grains of fine silver, or standard silver, excuse me. And this was then codified in the Mint Act of 1792, and it's the only place in the U.S. history where the dollar has been legally defined.
Okay.
So they determined what the dollar was based on the scientific analysis, and then codified that into law, fixing the unit of measure by which all other coins would be regulated.
So constitutionally then, the dollar is 373 point something grains of silver.
A silver coin containing 371 1/4 grains of standard silver.
Okay. So under the Constitution then, it's your argument that a Federal Reserve paper note is not a dollar.
That's correct. It is not a dollar. No more.
What is it then?
It is a bill of credit. It is like, for example, I know it says dollar on the bill, and people tell me all the time, well, it says dollar on it. I said, well, if I take a piece of paper and write cow on it, does that make it a cow? Of course not. So the argument goes away really quick. What's interesting about the bills of credit is that under the Articles of Confederation, the colonies, each colony had the power to emit their own bills of credit,
yes,
their own paper money.
Yes.
But it created havoc in the economy.
Yes.
And it was hyperinflated everything, and it really caused some serious problems. Then, when the Constitutional Convention was being established, that power in the Articles of Confederation transferred over to the first draft of the Constitution, and so it read: Congress shall have the power to coin money, emit bills of credit, and regulate the value thereof, etc. But then they had a debate about whether to keep that or not, and it was a pretty heated debate, and they voted at the end of the day 9-2 and had that power removed.
Okay.
So now we have a strict prohibition against printing paper money.
But we have paper money.
Yes, we do.
And how did that happen?
Well, Right. So from
Does that have something to do
1787.
with this guy named Andrew Jackson?
Negative.
Negative, okay.
From 1787 until the Civil War, right around during the Lincoln and Solomon P. Chase fight for the presidency.
Right.
There was no paper money being emitted at that time, except for certain banknotes, things like that. But those were private. Then when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, he appointed Solomon P. Chase as the Treasury Secretary.
Right.
But the coffers were empty, and we're about to go to war. Well, they needed to figure something out. So Solomon P. Chase authorized the emission of $300 million in bills of credit called the greenback.
Mm-hmm.
And that was used to help finance the Civil War, and he printed more eventually. And then he ended up resigning as the Treasury Secretary. Lincoln and him didn't get along, and he kept bluffing. He's like, I want to resign, and finally Lincoln called him on it, and he ended up resigning. But Lincoln ended up appointing him as the Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because as he's the sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a case came before him. I think it was around 1865, 1867.
So
around
Lincoln's
there.
dead, but he's still sitting on the court, right? Okay.
Yeah, right. So a case came before him called Hepburn versus Gridwald.
Okay.
And this case was about whether or not paper money was authorized under our Constitution.
Okay.
So here we have the man who actually authorized the printing of the paper money, now sitting as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, having to make a decision on his own decision.
And what did he find?
He actually found he was wrong, and he reversed his decision and said he had no constitutional authority to emit paper money.
Okay.
So at that point, paper money was unconstitutional.
But it's still, we have paper money.
Yes, we do.
What happened?
And shortly after that, it was short-lived. Another case came before the court called Knox versus Lee, and the other justices overturned the Solomon P. Chase and ruled that it was unconstitutional as an emergency measure.
Only as an emergency
Only
measure.
as an emergency measure.
Okay.
And then Juilliard versus Greenman came in after that and solidified that, went further and said Congress has the power to determine what is an emergency. So we've been...
that gets to be a really slippery slope.
Exactly. So here we have a strict prohibition under our Constitution and the Constitutional Convention, and then through a stealthy sort of transmogrification of our monetary system, we've been stuck with it ever since.
Okay. So somewhere in the 1870s, this occurs, and then we've been just printing illegal money ever since?
Pretty much. It's critical because we have people, if you go back to basics, again, it all goes back to the Constitution. What is the dollar? You got to go back to that question. And it's critical because we have Congress making policy on appropriation bills. We have Congress making policy on collection of taxes. We have people being paid and bills of credit, but not dollars. We have tax laws being written in terms of dollars, but they're not applicable anymore. We have court decisions being rendered in favor of dollars, but they're not existing anymore. So how does we're literally in a it's a complete circus as far as our monetary policy.
Well, how does the Federal Reserve come into all that?
Well, the Federal Reserve came about in 1910 when they conceived it in Jekyll Island, Georgia, when they took one quarter of the world's wealth represented, took a trip to Jekyll Island from Hoboken, New Jersey, and they ended up conceiving the Federal Reserve Act there took about a 2-week period. And then in December 24th, 1913, and at night when most of the other congressmen were away on holiday, they ended up passing the Federal Reserve Act.
So did they have a quorum of Congress when they passed it?
I believe at that time the quorum was valid.
Okay. So Congress, without amending the Constitution, gave up its authority to regulate the value of the dollar to a private board of bankers.
That's correct.
And has there ever been a Supreme Court case on whether or not they had the lawful authority to do that?
Negative, not that I am aware of. We've been close. There was the Schechter Poultry case dealing with the National Industrial Recovery Act that kind of had the same sort of delegation of authority issue in question, and the Supreme Court shot that down, actually stating that they said that we know of no known power in our law. That's what the court said, or something of, I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. So, but the problem is the Federal Reserve Act was not on the chopping block when that case came down, so it held.
Okay, and so practically, there are the value right now of the dollar, a real dollar, a silver coin dollar, is one silver coin dollar to 15 Federal Reserve notes, roughly.
It's probably about it's about right. Yeah, I'd say that.
So one legitimate silver dollar. So everyone's wages in terms of what they may owe for taxes is 1/15th. You're saying
Something like that. Yes. Well, here's a funny part. You have like, for example, statutes written in tax law, for example, that states before an assessment can be made, you must earn a certain dollar amount over the exemption amount.
Right.
So if you didn't earn dollars, as that term is used, then did you earn a certain dollar amount over the exemption amount, and therefore can an assessment be made? So that's a question currently that should be raised. Same thing with the court cases dealing with fines. You render fines in dollars, but those fines or those orders are avoidable because of the fact they're not possible.
I understand you've actually gotten traffic fines voided.
Three of them. Yes, it was a challenge. It took about 5 years, but it did occur.
You fought your traffic ticket for 5 years.
Yeah, 3 of them. Yeah,
3 of them.
Low risk, high reward.
Okay.
So that's how I look at it.
And so the court actually voided their orders because it wasn't possible to pay in dollars?
Well, the way it came back was the DMV sent me back a reinstatement of my license, non-pro-tunct, as if it never been suspended. The case has disappeared. I don't know whatever happened to them.
So you did.
But the only thing I can suffice is that after I submitted that 20-page notice of void order, the orders were void. There was nothing occurred.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ed, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
All right.